Good evening to everyone. I'm happy to announce our third session of the Human Brains Initiative of the Fondazione Prada, which is about culture and consciousness. So tonight our session is about languages and consciousness. And I'm proud to announce our two excellent speakers, two big shots in our field, Professor Stanislas Dehaene and Professor Andrea Moro. But before passing the word to them, I'm going to give you a small introduction about language and consciousness. So, language is probably one of the highest human cognitive abilities. And language, we learn it automatically early in life. We combine sounds to phonemes and then to words. And then we apply automatically rules, which we acquire because our parents talk to us. And we convey meaning with it. And we can use prosody and pragmatics. Just take as an example the sentence, "This is really good," okay? We can use a social context like, "It's really good," I'm honest, but I can use also something ironical. And it's a different meaning of it. Animals cannot do this, okay? So that's what I like to say, Homo sapiens became sapiens because of language. Okay, and now there's the link. Could language be considered as a necessary condition for consciousness? Okay, well, one has to keep in mind that animals have some sort of consciousness. In cognitive psychology, we know, take as an example the famous mirror test. You take an animal like an ape or an elephant. While they're sleeping, you design a dot, or you mark them with some color on the head, and the next morning when they wake up, you put them in front of a mirror. And the animal will immediately try to touch it because there's something new or wrong. It's a kind of consciousness, it's self-awareness. Okay? It's actually a little bit more complicated because there are different levels of consciousness, and I'm sure Stanislas Dehaene will talk about this much more in detail. Like in a simple medical term, consciousness, like saying, a patient is not anymore conscious because it's in a vegetative state or in coma. But in cognitive psychology, there are different levels. Okay? One could be like being aware of our inner thoughts, of what happens outside of us, and so on. And funnily enough, there's also an unconscious level of consciousness. Take as an example, subliminal messages. Who remembers in the 50s, in American cinemas, the Coca-Cola company would project on the cinema screen 10, 20 milliseconds images of a bottle of Coke saying, "Drink Coca-Cola." It doesn't come to your consciousness, but somehow it comes to your brain and people get thirsty and would start buying Coke. There's another point which is really interesting, and I've written here it on my slide. Can machines evolve towards consciousness? This is a big topic in our times, actually, because of robots, artificial intelligence, and multiple algorithms where you try to produce a machine that can understand our emotions and react consecutively. Okay? And I'm sure our speakers are going to talk about this today. So, our first speaker is Professor Stanislas Dehaene. He is very famous in our field. He is the chair of experimental cognitive psychology at the Collège de France. He is the director of the Neurospin Center in Paris, which, to my knowledge, is the most advanced neuroimaging center in France. Stan, correct me if I'm wrong. And he earned his PhD in cognitive sciences in Paris at the School for Higher Studies of Social Sciences. He did his PhD, his postdoc at the University of Oregon with Michael Posner, and I'm sure much of his work on consciousness was influenced by Michael Posner. And Stan is known in our field because of his many studies on language, on the one hand. Take as an example, the famous visual word form area in the brain, one of his discoveries. There's a dedicated area in our brain in which letters, the visual form of letters, are combined into words, okay? But he is also very famous for his multiple studies on consciousness and non-consciousness. And that's what he's going to talk about. Stan has earned many prizes and awards in the last 20 years, and the list would be just too long to tell everything here, so forgive me. But I would like to make a point about his excellent books, okay, which I can recommend to everyone, about the number sense, reading in the brain, and consciousness and the brain, okay? So highly recommended. Okay, I pass the word to Stan. And he's talking. How are you?
Yes, I'm good, thank you.
And I'm sure you're going to give us an excellent overview about consciousness versus non-consciousness, and what makes us unique compared to primates.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction.
Please go ahead.
I will exactly try to discuss the two topics you mentioned. What is consciousness, and what part of consciousness may be unique in humans since we have language and language-related abilities. And I will try to do something which is a little bit audacious in 30 minutes. I would like to cover two main points which correspond to two of my, my two latest books, actually. First, I'd like to discuss consciousness, and my main point will be that the basic operation of conscious access can and should be studied in both human and non-human animals. It's not at all unique to humans. We've discovered that there are signatures of consciousness that can be found at the brain level that are shared between animals and humans. And this science of consciousness is actually quite advanced. I think that few people know this, but it's so advanced that I would like to show that it can now be used to identify residual consciousness in brain lesion patients. However, my second point will be that there is something special to humans, and this is something I describe in a more recent book, How We Learn. My point will be that the contents of consciousness have become richer in humans. Why? Because we have a language of thought. We have a combinatorial ability, specific perhaps to the human mind, to develop languages, of course, natural language, but also the language of mathematics, of music, and the language of theory of mind, the capacity to represent ourselves and others. And I would like to argue that this is a significant enrichment of our capacity to think about ourselves and our own consciousness. So I'll start with the first point, conscious access and how we can study it. And I would like to show it in a very simple terms with this classical visual illusion due to Ted Adelson at MIT. You look at this scene here, and you might think, well, where is the illusion? You know, there's this checkerboard, and when there are some gray, dark gray or black cells and white cells, what's the problem? Well, the illusion is that these two cells are exactly the same. They are the same exact gray level. And you can see that now, I hope. But if I remove the occluders, one is dark, the other is light. I hope this illusion works even though I'm not physically present with you. What's happening? Well, what's happening is that your brain is noticing, maybe unconsciously, that there is a shadow. It's not really a shadow, it's just a dark area in your retina, but it can be interpreted as a shadow coming from this object here. And if you subtract the shadow, then the color of the object should really be lighter here for this object which is in the shade compared to this one which is in the light. So your brain lets you see consciously only the result of an enormous amount of unconscious inference. This was the term of Hahnemann from Helmholtz. And I think we've only been able to validate this general idea from Helmholtz, that there is a lot of unconscious processing. We're not aware of what's happening in our retina, which is the same exact shade of gray here. We are aware of the end result of a long computation. So a lot of early perceptual processing is unconscious. And conscious perception relates to a late wave of activity, which creates a stable state where we see an inference about the world. And we've integrated the information together. For instance, the information about the object and the shadow and the particular objects that are in the shade. We've integrated this information together into a conscious representation. So this is going to be my strategy to study consciousness. It's been my strategy for about 20 years now. The first ingredient is to find some interesting visual illusions that allow us to manipulate conscious perception. And I would like to mention that we are all sensitive to those illusions that I'm showing right now, whether we are a monkey or a human. For instance, in the classic illusion of binocular rivalry, which was studied by the pioneer Nikos Logothetis, I show you two pictures, one in each eye. So maybe your left eye is seeing the face and your right eye is seeing the house. But consciously, you don't see both pictures. Consciously, what you see is an alternation of one picture and the other. So one picture is conscious while the other is not. In the masking illusion in the middle here, we flash you a digit, but if it's short enough and presented with a mask of letters, you never see the digit, you only see the letters, and so on and so forth. I won't detail all of these illusions. The idea is very simple. We can track in the brain what's happening to this hidden figure, the digit 9 here, or the picture of the house when the face is conscious. And in this way, we can ask a very simple question. What difference does it make for a stimulus to be consciously reported, seen by the subject, or to a stimulus which is unconscious? So there are two additional ingredients. One is the careful quantification, of introspection. We can ask for reports. Subjects tell us, I'm seeing the face, I'm seeing the house. And the remarkable thing is that even monkeys can report. They can click on buttons to tell us what they see. And then we can present stimuli that are just on the threshold. So the most beautiful experiments are experiments where we present a single stimulus. It's always the same, but we sort it as a function of whether subjects claim to see it or not to see it. And we can really, in this case, understand what's the difference between conscious and unconscious representations. And then, of course, we use all our panoply of brain imaging tools, neuronal recordings, to track the fate of these conscious and unconscious stimuli. So this is the story that I tell in this book, Consciousness in the Brain. There have been many, many experiments. First, there have been many experiments looking at unconscious processing. And this is just a very coarse picture of the literally tens of brain areas that have been found to be activatable by a subliminal stimulus. It's not quite like you said in the introduction, by the way. This famous experiment about Coca-Cola never actually occurred. It's a hoax. But real experiments in the lab have allowed us to flash numbers or flash words, including, for instance, fearful words, and to see that so many of these specialized brain areas can be contacted unconsciously. Probably over 95% of everything that's computed by our brain is unconscious. We are only conscious of a very small part. So what is this part? Well, my colleague Jean-Pierre Changeux was speaking yesterday, and Lionel Nakache and I have been proposing this view of a global neuronal workspace. What do we mean by that? We mean that, first of all, we have to accept that in the brain, virtually any cortical processor can operate unconsciously, chains of such processors. So these processors are represented by little dots on this diagram here. But the idea is that what we experience as consciousness is when these processors share information. There is a central system here which allows a piece of information, the green piece of information here, to become globally available, shared with other brain areas. And we think that there is a special architecture in the brain for that. We've called it the global neuronal workspace, a set of neurons that have these long distance connections that allow to broadcast the information in a brain-wide manner. And what we mean by being conscious is we mean that we are able to take the information and report it verbally, but also use it in an extremely flexible manner because it's being broadcasted to virtually any processor in the brain. Unconscious processing is very specialized, it's local, it's chains of automatized processing. Conscious processing is global, broadcasting, sharing of information. And at the physiological level, our hypothesis is that conscious access corresponds to the ignition of workspace neurons. They all come active together. Imagine all of these areas coming active together simultaneously to encode a particular representation. That's what we mean by broadcasting, the sharing of information. And then of course, there is a sort of global state which remains stable or metastable for a fraction of a second and allows also the signals to flow back to the original place where they started. So imagine that for a short while, for less than a second, your brain is occupied by one particular representation, exclusive of others. When you are awake of the green representation here, you cannot become aware simultaneously of another chain, like in orange or in red here. They are subliminal or unconscious. There is a lot of evidence for this model. I won't be able to show you too much tonight. I just want to say that there is anatomical evidence. For instance, there is really a system in the brain at the central level, mostly involving prefrontal cortex and what we call associative areas of the brain in the parietal and temporal lobes. And this really acts as a sort of central sharing system, a bottleneck where information can be shared. These are some of the earliest experiments we've done where we were flashing these words that are subliminal and trying to see what's the difference in brain activation when we present a word that remains invisible. The subject says there was no word, I couldn't see anything, or a word that was visible, and subjects say, well, I know what I saw, there was a particular word. And you can see some of these differences, they are enormous here. It's not so difficult to study consciousness because the differences between conscious and unconscious processing are actually quite large. Unconscious processing remains focused on specialized circuits for reading, including this visual word form area that was mentioned in the introduction, this region that cares about the shapes of words. But conscious words activate a much broader circuit that the information gets broadcasted to many more areas that are involved in recognizing the meaning of the word, storing it in memory, and so on. And the same sort of thing occurs with sound. If you present an undetected sound, it activates local auditory areas. It does go into the cortex. But if the sound becomes detected, even if it's the very same sound, you have much more global activation, especially you can see in prefrontal cortex. I skip over so many experiments, but I want to mention that it's possible these days to go down to the single neuron. This is the beautiful work of Rodrigo Cue and Quiroga and collaborators with Itzhak Fried. What they have done is to flash pictures like this one and to present them in a condition where they are only seen about half of the time. So the trials in blue are the ones where the picture is seen. And you can see that there are neurons, this is a neuron in the anterior temporal cortex, that fire only when that particular picture is seen. These are neurons that code for a concept, such as here the World Trade Center or New York, but these neurons will fire only when the person is consciously aware of that concept. And so on the red trials where the person says there was no picture, I couldn't see which picture it was, then there is no firing of the neurons. It gets even better than this. So in more recent experiment, the same research group has been doing these experiments where there is an ambiguous picture. This is a funny one where you can see a sort of mixture of Bob Marley and Whoopi Goldberg. And there are neurons that care about Whoopi Goldberg. They will only activate when the person says, I saw Whoopi Goldberg. But if the very same picture is presented and the person says, I was not conscious of Whoopi Goldberg, it was Bob Marley, then the neuron does not fire to the same level. And all of that, of course, started in the monkey, and there are beautiful experiments in the monkey showing that in the prefrontal cortex in particular, and also in the temporal cortex, neurons again code for the monkey sees, but not for what it doesn't see. So in the top condition, you can present a face, but because of the particular condition, the monkey does not see the face, but only this particular, oh, sorry, it's the contrary. The monkey starts seeing this and then sees the face, and you see the neurons firing. But if the monkey starts seeing the face and then the face is erased by these checkerboards, then the neuron does not fire. So we have single neuron correlates of consciousness. And in a recent experiment in Science with Peter Roxema and colleagues, we were able to show that there are really mechanisms of consciousness that are extremely similar in the monkey and in the human. What we did here was to flash some stimuli at a very low luminance, such that on some cases they were not seen at all because they were below the threshold for seeing. Then they could be just at threshold, and they could be much easier to see if the contrast was higher. So our colleagues in Amsterdam then recorded from neurons in areas V1, V4, and prefrontal cortex. And they were able to see what happens to these stimuli in the brain, what sorts of activation they give as a function of whether the monkey reports that he has seen the stimulus, because he makes a saccade to it, or whether the monkey reports that he has not seen the stimulus because he makes a saccade to another location. And we can see there is a lot of information, of course, in this paper, which is technical, but I just want to show you some very basic stuff. You can see that you can get essentially the same level of activation in visual area V4, whether the stimulus is seen by the monkey or whether it's missed. It was there, created this huge wave of activation, but the monkey reports there was no stimulus. I couldn't see it. So this means that these visual areas, paradoxically, are not sufficient to understand consciousness. Even consciousness of an extremely small visual dot is not in visual areas. So where is it? Well, if you look at prefrontal cortex, you see that there is a very good correlate of consciousness. Prefrontal cortex ignites in this very speeded activation suddenly on seen trials. And on the contrary, if the same exact stimulus is presented, but the monkey misses it, there's the beginning of activation, but then it fails. Okay? And this difference becomes huge. We call that a nonlinear ignition. It's nonlinear in the sense that it's unrelated to the size of the stimulus or to the contrast of the stimulus. It's an intrinsic shift, balance between a high state of activity where you're conscious and a low state of activity where you're not conscious. This is what we call ignition. And notice that even on the false alarm, so there was no stimulus, but the monkey said, oh, I think I saw something, and makes a saccade, you can see that there is in fact this ignition occurring in the monkey's brain. Now, all of these experiments initially were done with conditions in which we stimulate the brain. But of course, the brain is conscious even when it's not stimulated. If you are lying in bed, in darkness, without any sort of visual stimuli, you can still have mental images and have conscious activity. And so it's been interesting to ask, how can we detect consciousness in this situation when there is no stimulation? Can we still see that there is a conscious brain? And beautiful work, particularly by Marcus Reichel, have been showing that there seems to be a correlate of consciousness in the spontaneous resting state activity of the brain. The brain is never inactive. It keeps changing its activity all the time. These areas wax and wane together. And this is a possible correlate of consciousness in the sense that it partially predicts what the subject is thinking about at a particular moment. So for instance, if you are doing mental calculation, you will activate these dorsal areas that I have studied that have to do with arithmetic and mathematics. If you convey mental images and elicit mental images, you will activate your visual areas. If you think of playing tennis, you might activate these anterior areas for premotor gestures and so on. But there was a paradox. The paradox is that many of these networks, many of this spontaneous brain activity continue to be active under anesthesia. So what is unique to consciousness and what is not? We were able to sort out this question recently in the past 5 years by looking at the dynamics of activity. What you see here is the dynamics of activity in the monkey brain as he is awake. And you can see that it's constantly changing. It is what William James called the perchings and flights of a bird. Consciousness is like a bird that sometimes sits and has a stable state, but often flies away to a new state. It constantly changes. It's not a stable state in the brain for a long time. So we thought maybe in these dynamics, we could find a signature of consciousness. And that's what we found. In the monkey, we were able to anesthetize the monkey and compare different states of anesthesia. So there is the awake state, the moderately anesthetized and the deeply anesthetized state. And we were able to look at the dynamics of brain activity as a function of consciousness. And what we have found is that there is a dramatic difference. When you're anesthetized, your brain is no longer as dynamic. Its dynamics is completely dominated by one particular state of activity, which we can see here on the right, which is actually essentially the matrix of structural connections. The anatomy of the brain is driving the activity. It's very simple. Even during anesthesia, the brain is not completely silent, but it's essentially random spikes which are traveling through the anatomical network. So it's one state of activity if you want, but it's not a coding state. It's just a state of traveling waves in a network. But when you're awake, it's completely different. You have all of this richness of other states that come in and become much more frequent than the state on the right. And they essentially tell you that the brain is changing its configuration in order to have different kinds of thoughts. So when we quantified this capacity to have multiple dynamic states of the brain, and these are all global states, they are all ignition-like in the sense that they concern many different areas, we found that this is a good signature of consciousness. The more diversity of dynamic states, the more it is likely that the subject is awake and conscious. And what is very nice is that this work, which was started in the monkey, was generalized to the human subjects. This is the newer works that was done in collaboration with many, essentially most, if not all, of the labs that are collaborating together to understand consciousness in human patients. What we saw is that if we study healthy controls, they have the same dynamic signatures of changing states as we had in the awake monkeys. But if we move to patients in minimal consciousness, and especially patients in so-called vegetative states, we think that most of these patients are completely unconscious because they have stopped responding to external stimuli. We found that they tend to be dominated in their dynamics by this state that resembles the structure of the brain, the anatomy of the brain. I don't expect you to understand in detail all of these findings, but I do want to come out with this basic understanding. We now have signatures of consciousness. Many of these signatures started to be found in the monkey and relate to this ignition of a global brain state. But once we found them in the monkey, we were able also to generalize them to the human subjects. And so I'm showing you even more signatures here. We don't have to use visual stimuli. We can use auditory sequences and see how far they propagate in the brain. And if they create this global state, which is relatively late, after 200 milliseconds of propagation of activity in the brain, then it's likely that the patient is conscious. Likewise, we can just look at spontaneous activity, whether the brain is exchanging signals at a distance through this global workspace. And if the brain is exchanging signals, it's very likely that the brain is a conscious brain. And minimally conscious or vegetative state patients, they don't seem to have enough of this global communication. So this has reached a level now where we really understand consciousness enough to diagnose patients and tell to some extent, to a large extent, whether they are conscious or not. So recently, just 3 years ago, we published this paper to ask, what is consciousness, and especially could machines have it? I think it's very clear that we begin to understand how conscious processing works in the human brain, and that consciousness, according to us, is just a computational property. It's a level of information processing. The machine of the brain, at a certain level, needs to share information. And so this architecture could be implemented in machines. It's just an aspect of the machine of the brain. So of course, we can distinguish a first level where there's just unconscious processing in the brain. I've told you mostly about this level 1 of conscious access, where the brain needs to select a particular piece of information and share it with other areas. So the information is amplified, become the focus of additional processing and sharing through other modules. I want to tell you now a little bit more about what we called in this paper the level 2, the conscious self-representation. There is something more. We are able not only to hold on to information, share it, but also we know that we have the information. And in humans, this goes very far. We have a real sense of self that tells us we know that we know. We know that you know that I know. We have this theory of mind, which includes our own mind. So I would like to suggest that there is here a sort of level which may be a bit more unique to humans. Well, maybe not unique, but better developed in humans. In this paper in the journal Neuron in 2015, we speculated, based on a review of the literature, about what could be unique to human level representations. And there is no doubt that there is a lot that humans and other primates share. Here on this illustration, we have all that we share in the domain of sequence processing. All the primates are able to understand that there is a sequence of notes, for instance, or a sequence of syllables being presented. And it may be surprising to you, but even non-human primates are able to chunk and discover that there are words in this sequence. They're able to understand that there's a first element and a second and a third. And they're able to understand that there are patterns, like Totobu, Momi2, which is AAB. But there seems to be something which is unique to humans and that we see in the domain of language, but also in the domain of mathematical patterns, and perhaps in the domain of theory of mind. This is a sense of recursion and the building of tree structures through recursive structures. In the domain of language, for instance, the work of Noam Chomsky and much of modern linguistics, Andrea Moro will speak about that in a minute, has told us that when I give you a little sentence, such as, or phrase, like those gifty car factory workers, you should not think of it as a series of words. It's not just a sequence, it's a tree. For instance, it's really car factory. These two words belong together. It's a factory that makes cars. And the workers are from the car factory. Okay, so the workers are in the factory. These are nested structures that we also find in mathematics. And of course, in theory of mind, if I tell you, I think you believe I am right, what you think about is really this phrase, which itself is made of a subphrase and so on. Our key hypothesis here is that the brain is able to compress information using nested tree structures. And in my book, How We Learned, I try to defend the idea that this is a new learning mechanism in humans. I'm not alone in this idea, by the way, and here I'm illustrating the work of Josh Tenenbaum, who's been arguing that thanks to grammatical structures, we are able to be scientists. We are able to acquire scientific information about the external world because we have a generative grammar of concepts. So it's not just inside the surface of language, the sentences that we produce, but inside our brain, we have a language of thought that allows us to create combinatorial structures. And this grammar may be so general that it can express many different things, such as a map, for instance, a grid, but also a tree structure or a hierarchy, or just a linear order, like the numbers, for instance. Josh Tenenbaum and his colleagues were able to show that in this way you can model the human acquisition of concepts such as the tree structure of species. The discovery by Charles Darwin that the species are best thought about as a tree. The general idea is that the human mind has this extraordinary ability to differentiate new concepts based on combinations of simpler ones. So combinations through grammatical structures allow us to differentiate our space of concepts. And I like to use this metaphor of a beautiful tree or a beautiful coral. That's what our brains develop as we learn. We develop tree structures that cover our understanding of the external world. So how do we know it's true? Well, we don't. This is really the topic of a lot of recent research. I would like to finish my talk by discussing extremely recent research that we've been doing in the domain of mathematics, in the domain of the concepts of geometry, this remarkable human ability to make symbolic drawings, such as this deer here, but also this square. This is in a Lascaux cave, 18,000 years ago. I'll stop for a cartoon for a second. I hope you like it. These are humans looking at a hunting scene and they say, we have to record this or no one's going to believe us because they are seeing the world in geometric shapes. Of course, it's a joke, but if this view is correct, only humans are able to think of geometric shapes because this requires a combination of concepts, combinations of lines that are parallel, the notion that there are 4 lines. So just 4 lines is already a first syntactical operation, 4 equal sides and 4 equal right angles. That's the definition of a square. According to the view that I'm defending, there's something quite unique about the ability of humans to think about such concepts. How old is this sense of geometry? It's probably very, very old. This is an artifact from 70,000 years old that has parallel lines forming equilateral triangles. This zigzag is already 540,000 years old. And so it's not Homo sapiens, it's Homo erectus, who has drawn these parallel lines forming a zigzag. And anthropologists who find these patterns immediately know that it's a human. There is no other animal, even a chimpanzee, doesn't do this sort of patterns. Bifaces and spheroids point to the fact that this could be as old as perhaps 2 million years old. So a very old aspect of hominization. In the lab, we've been studying whether there's something quite unique to humans here. So we tried to find a test that both humans and the monkeys could pass. And we decided that we would have this test of the outlier. I will let you look at this, and you have to decide where is the different shape, okay? So you have a touch screen, and you click, and presumably by now you found that you have to click on this shape here, which is different. Matthias Sablemeyer, for his PhD, has been designing all of these shapes that are extremely well matched. They're all quadrilaterals of the same size, same total size of the distances between the dots and so on. But some are extremely irregular, like rectangle and square, and humans understand these regularities, and some become more and more irregular. And what we do is we ask subjects to detect whether there is a different one where a corner has been displaced. What we have found is a remarkable effect of geometrical regularity. As humans, we are much better in detecting the oddball when it's among regular shapes, such as squares or rectangles. We have a sense of geometrical regularity, and when we are shown contrariwise an irregular figure, we are very poor. We are unable to decide that this shape is now different, that the corner has been displaced. Other shapes fall in between. For instance, you can find here this shape which is irregular among parallelograms, but parallelograms are already more difficult than squares or rectangles. So a sort of monotonous effect of regularity. Now, the first thing we did was to show that this is really a human universal, at least in our hands. Whenever we do this experiment, in all sorts of variants that I won't have time to explain, we find that humans show this effect. It's even true of preschoolers, or even if we go to Africa, to this Himba population. So both of these groups of subjects are not well educated. They don't go to school. This is before school. In the case of the Himba, they don't even have names for these shapes. And yet they always found immediately that a square or rectangle is more regular than a random quadrilateral. Question, of course, is this unique to humans? Are we the only species to be conscious of geometrical regularities? So we collaborated with Joël Fagot in the south of France. Joël has put together an amazing facility where baboons are in a group. They live together. They are essentially free to roam in this arena, but at any time, they can enter this booth, and in the booth, they'll find a computer and a video game. So 24 hours a day, they can enter willingly and play a video game. And some go at 2 in the morning and go play a little bit. This is an amazing facility because it allows you to collect data from more than 30 baboons and to collect thousands of trials per week. It's an amazingly productive area for the observation of behavior. And the monkeys are essentially free. You know, they collaborate. The computer recognizes which monkey is entering the booth and presenting just the right trials for this particular individual. So we trained the baboons to click on the picture, which is different. This is our outlier task. And first, we train them with pictures like this one, which is not geometric. It's just a different flower. And we train them with all of these pairs of elements. So click on the orange among blue, or the blue among orange. And we showed that monkeys, the baboons here, could understand this task. They understood the outlier task. They understood that they had to click on the shape which is different for all of these shapes. And they could generalize to these new shapes. Once we did that, we tried our geometrical regularity test. And the surprise was there was no effect whatsoever. All of these shapes, whether they are highly regular, are treated the same as the irregular ones for baboons. Baboons are completely different from humans on this test. They have very little regression with regularity. You see, it's very different from humans. And it's not that they behave randomly. They all do the same sort of thing. So they are all correlated with each other. So each line here is one particular baboon at different times. You can see that the hot colors indicate that they're all correlated with each other. So they do something, but they don't do like humans. What do they do? Again, without going into the details, we are able to understand what the baboons do with a model of the ventral visual areas, the unconscious processing pathways that allow you to process a geometrical shape just like any other picture, a face or a location, by a sort of feed-forward network that identify what it is. This can explain the baboon behavior. All of the baboons are well predicted by this convolutional neural network, but the humans are not. And you can see that in order to explain the humans, we have to have a completely different kind of model, a symbolic model that takes into account the symbolic geometrical properties. Are the two lines equal? Are these angles equal? Are these angles straight right angles? Are there equal sides, and so on and so forth? And when we list all of these properties and allow the system to assemble them together into the representation of the picture, then we get a good model for what the humans do. They are sensitive to regularity in a way that the baboons are not. We really think these are two strategies. So when we test the preschoolers or the himbas, they actually use a mixture of these two strategies. As humans, we have, of course, such a visual network, and we are conscious of the external world very similarly to the monkeys. But we can also adopt this symbolic stance and look at a word through the picture of this language of thought, where we discover scientific regularities. We can think of something like a square, and of course, many more complex thoughts, such as all of the concepts of mathematics, the construction of the pyramid of mathematics. So I'm reaching my conclusion now, and it will be very simple. I think that there is something special about human consciousness. First of all, a conscious global workspace is present in all primates, and probably many other animal species, such as birds, for instance. We share with other primates the same core concepts of number, object, space, person, but we possess something more. We possess a language of thought that allows us to discretize these concepts into mental symbols and to combine them recursively into mental programs. And I would like to argue, and this is of course a hypothesis that needs to be proven by further work, that during hominization, the human brain architecture must have changed. We already have a workspace, but that workspace allows the construction of recursive languages in several different brain networks, language areas, of course, but also mass responsive areas, theory of mind regions, giving rise to the extraordinarily complex experiences that we enjoy. If this view is correct, the basic apparatus of consciousness is the same, but the contents of consciousness are much, much richer in humans due to this ability to think scientifically, recursively about the external world. With that, I would like to thank you very much. The research that I presented today is discussed in these two books, although the research on geometry is actually unpublished and is work that we are doing right at this moment. So I look forward to your questions about this more recent work. Thank you very much.
So Stan, thank you for this wonderful presentation. And as I've noted, so language does make a difference. I know already there are many questions for you, but as mentioned before, we'll have the session for questions after the second speaker. And I just want to remind the audience that the event is online, so you can also send us your questions right now online, and I will read them at the end. So I have the pleasure to present a colleague, and not only a colleague, a friend, Professor Andrea Moro from the University School of Advanced Studies in Pavia. He's a very, very well-known linguist worldwide. He was the co-founder actually of the Department of Cognitive Sciences at my own institution, the San Raffaele Scientific Institute. Andrea earned his PhD in linguistics at the University of Padua. He did a postdoc at the University of Geneva, but he's also very well known to spend a lot of time as a visiting scholar in Boston, at both the Harvard and the MIT, where he still collaborates with Noam Chomsky. His field of research was mostly based on the theory of syntax. Andrea is one of the few linguists who, very soon, when the field of neuroimaging came out, combined neuroimaging with linguistics. So in order to investigate better how the brain stores and acquires and processes syntax. One of his most fascinating research fields is actually what he's going to talk about tonight, is about impossible versus possible languages. Andrea, I already know that many people are asking what are impossible languages, so I hope you will tell us, you give us a clear definition about impossible languages. And as I've done with Stan, I also want to underline, Andrea has published wonderful books. I mentioned just two of them, which are really, really a must read for everyone, The Boundaries of Babel and Impossible Languages, really. Andrea, the word is up to you.
Okay, thank you. What happens when linguistics meets a neuroscience? This is what I would like to show you tonight. Try to answer, in fact, a very deep question. What makes language a human language? And by doing so, in fact, trying to answer another deeper question, what makes a being a human being? In fact, let me start straightforwardly by observing a capacity that appears to be specific of humans. Let's pretend to have a micro dictionary made just of 4 words: killed, the, Hercules, and lion. Human brains are very capable. It's easy for any human brains to combine in a string and say Hercules killed the lion, or even in another order, the lion killed Hercules. We immediately understand that for us, it's easy to convey different meaning with the same bricks, the same wall, in a different order. Of course, not all the orders is possible. In fact, there is at least one order which makes no sense. Hercules, lion, killed them. Then syntax in first approximation can be justified as the capacity to generate meaning and by permuting the order of words. Of course, this is just a very naive presentation. Syntax has a very, very complex mathematical structure that started to be studied in the late 50s by Noam Chomsky, exactly at MIT. And that first theorem concerning the nature of human syntax are the basic standards to start to understand this aspect of any human language. Actually, one thing that I just said, that all and only humans can use syntax to express their thoughts, is not a new idea. In fact, at least Descartes, in a Discours de la Méthode, was able to recognize exactly this capacity. Let's read his own words, translated in English. There are no person as to being capable of joining together different words and thereby compose a declaration by which to make their thoughts understood. And on the other hand, there is no other animal, however perfect or happily circumstanced, which can do the like. That was already clear by that time. Now one could ask whether scientists checked all animals, if there is no species of a certain insect, maybe on the other side of the world, that can produce meaning by permuting the same words in a string. Well, science always has to go through generalization, but we have to be careful and at least try to compare the kind of animals that we feel to be closer to us. So, for example, chimps. And there was an experiment in the late 70s led by Tom Bever, where a group of scientists lived with a little chimp. The name of the chimp was Nim Chimpsky because of the influence of the linguist. And here you see a picture of Anna-Laure Petito, who was trying to teach sign language, which, by the way, we know to be a complete human grammar, with the only fact that you don't express word with sound, but with gesture. And Nim was able to learn a lot of words. In fact, 128 different words. When it comes to sentences, not one of 119 different sequences made any difference because of the syntax of the words. So we can be pretty sure to say that when we understand syntax, we understand the fingerprints of human languages, and in fact, probably the fingerprint of the human mind itself. Now you may ask, what do syntacticians do when you go to work every morning? And I will try to show you what I do every morning, first of all, in a very approximate way. That is this one. You may ask what I'm showing now, and I may, on my turn, ask you to describe what you see. If you had to describe what you see on the phone, for example, you would say that there are violet dots, and then red dots, and then white, and then yellow dots, and then from this dot to this dot, there is a distance, and blah, blah, blah. You describe these scattered amounts of elements in a plate. Then what a linguist does is turn it upside down, in a sense, or look at the other face and see what happens to elements that are connected at a distance. In fact, sentences appear as string of words, but if we look at them from behind, we discover the hidden and intricate structure that connects them at a distance. Though this is precisely what we need to do if we want to understand syntax and the core of any human language. Now, let's shift from this, a pictorial way of looking at stuff with a precise example, because I want you to get at least the real mechanics of what I mean by syntax. Let's make an experiment together. Let's say this string of words, a noun and a verb, a subject and a predicate, depending on the kind of analysis you get. John sings. There is kind of a glue that keeps them together and makes a sentence out of these two elements. Now, John is singular, sings is singular. What happens if John, which remains singular, is connected with a verb which is plural? The sentence is ungrammatical. The sequence is, so to speak, broken by the fact that there is no match in the number. John is singular, sing is plural. Now my question is it always the case that this very sequence of two elements never occurs in a grammatical sentence? And the answer, although prima facie seems to be no, is in fact yes. It's easy enough for any human being to understand that if I make John be preceded by certain words, the sequence becomes legal. The very same sequence, John sing, becomes possible in those who love John sing. Why? We understand that very easily, because John is not the subject of sing, is the object of love. And in fact, the subject of sing is those. What you see here in front of you is exactly the core capacity of any human grammar. And tells you one thing: there is one object, a sentence, who love John, that can be included in the same object, that is another sentence. In other words, we have two consequences. The first, the linear order is irrelevant in syntax. John sing and John sing have the same linear order, but in one case is okay, the other case is not. What matters is the hierarchical structure. In a sense, it's like playing with an object. And I think that it's perhaps not by chance that kids, maybe Stan would say something about that, kids are actually happy to play with these things. Playing is part of our cognitive capacity. But now there is another interesting aspect to be combined with this to reach the recipe for any human language, and it's the following. Let me go back to a kind of example like before. Take the girls run. Then you may ask what happened to my slide, as if something is, rolling down on the one hand. But I want to do the same strategy as before. You have the girls and you have run. Now, look what I am doing. I put a sentence in between the two. The girls who love John run. But I can do that again. The girl who Mary says love John run. And again, the girl who Peter thinks Mary says love John run. And again, the girl who Jackie believes Peter thinks Mary says love John run. And again, the girls who Ed knows Jackie believes Peter thinks Mary says love John run. I think you're bored enough to let me stop with this simple example, but tell you two things. The idea of encapsulating things, nesting things, boxing things, one in another, has no upper limit. Building hierarchies can be done forever. Exactly was said before, this also happened in the other two codes, that is arithmetics and musics. Now, taking together these two facts, the fact that you can include something in the same thing, and the fact that this process can be iterated ad infinitum, you reach the fundamental principle of syntax that was already expressed in syntactic structures. Namely, no syntactic rule can be based on linear order, or equivalently, all rules must be based on hierarchy. In fact, you can actually express the same principle upside down and say that an impossible syntactic rule is one based on linear order instead of hierarchy. Now we face the first interesting problem where linguistics, neuroscience face together and raise, in fact, one question that lies at the very center of reflection of philosophy ever since Western philosophy started, at least with Plato. Is syntax, this complicated object I try to describe, determined by nature or by nurture? This is exactly the problem that we've been facing for 2,500 years. And this long-standing crucial question, neuroscience has allowed us to provide a novel strategy to answer it. That is, let's try to measure brain reaction to the exposure of impossible languages. It is the very first time that humans can try that, because neuroscience has offered us the capability with neuroimaging to explore what happens inside of a brain without opening the skull of a person, which is kind of an advantage in case you want to study how people speak. More generally, though, I would like to highlight that the idea of exploring reality through what is not real, necessarily not real, is a very innovative strategy that people have especially expressed in mathematics, but in general, when you cannot explain why something exists, you can try to explain why something else cannot exist. And this is the strategy that I would like to show you. First of all, I have a kind of a preliminary question, and one that you may also have in your mind. Yeah, I'm speaking of syntax, I'm speaking of the brain, but how do we know that there is a network inside of our brain which is dedicated to syntax? Why I'm asking that? Because when I speak, of course, I give you the syntactic rules. I exploit the syntactic rules, but I also convey meaning and syntax come together. So how can we be sure that there is a network for syntax and everything cannot be traced back to meaning at all? Then you can do something which is a privilege when it comes to work. What I have here is impossible plants taken from the the very famous fake manuscript, manuscript that also have an impossible writing there. So we made an impossible language. Now, although I'm sure that I have the best simultaneous translation now on here, I have to have a slide, two slides, which cannot be translated. Let me first of all try to speak to those who understand Italian and make this experiment. Look at this sentence. Higulco gianigeva le brale. No Italian will understand that. But in fact, no other person in the world, because this is just pure syntax without meaning, and I can go on. N'affantavano gli oprammi, il lappento non tonce mai, tutti i gorpotti sono stati gasporati, le pitanghe sono state gasporate. Il triago fabbisce ogni lustasio. I hope that the person that may accidentally have, gone through this talk right now would understand that I'm not talking any language I don't know. I'm just making it up. Similar things can be done in English. And then what you do is try to see what brain computes when you have pure syntactic stuff in your brain. Same thing for those who speak English. The goal comes to browse, many gluxes at it, every blick has plucked the flust, the coves were asserted, the goal has plucked the flust, every blick at it, the brows were asserted. Similar things. So we have a language that has no meaning at all, although it may be evocative. In fact, in the literature of all countries, you have poems that are made of fake words. You have the Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. You have Il Lonfo by the Italian Maraini. You have many, many examples. What we did in the experiment was try to reduce to the minimum the amount of evocative effect. And what we found was an activation of a specific activation of the brain. In other words, and this work was done at San Raffaele first, and there are persons, in fact, Stefano Cappa, Daniela Pirani, and Marco Tretamanti, who actually were the first small community that allowed me to express this. I owe a lot to Stefano because, even the history of science tells you how difficult it is when two disciplines try to get together. And that was our first experiment. And the first result was that it showed the selective role of a deep component of Broca's area, BA44, and subcortical elements, the left nucleus caudate syntactic processing. Interestingly enough, this experiment was replied by other group, in fact, one by David Embeck and Alec Morantz at MIT, and another one by Martin Monti and Daniel Osherson in another university in Cambridge and Sheffield. Actually, we have the preliminary question has been answered. We do have a syntactic network for syntax because when you are proposed with a language that has syntax but doesn't have meaning, you do have a specific activation. And now we can get to the core experiment, the one of impossible languages. The experiment was to look what happens in Broca's area, we took a group of monolingual native speakers of German, and we taught them a micro-Italian. That is an Italian made of 12 verbs, 12 noun, few preposition, articles, so on. And then we measure Broca's activity relation with the possible and impossible rules. Again, the possible were the one based on hierarchy, that is on strings that can be as long as possible, and the other one impossible rules that are made of linear order. And to be sure that we did not just detect a similarity among languages, we did the experiment with micro-Japanese. The experiment turned out to be done as follows. There were in fact 3 experiments. I choose to illustrate you just one of them. How was the experiment designed? With a very simple paradigm. First, we measured the accuracy. That is, we wanted to see how better these people were doing after training with these rules. And then we measure the blood flow in Broca's area, assuming that the more you have blood, the more the area was computing the rules. What happens with possible rules? It happens what we think everyone would think would happen. Namely, the better you are in understanding the rules, the more Broca's area calls for energy to activate the metabolism and to process the rules. But with impossible rules, we had exactly the opposite result. Namely, Broca's area was progressively inhibited, and the brain, so to speak, recognized the fact that the rules that were not based on hierarchy, but were just based on linear order, were fake rules. So in a sense, the idea that the answer to the question whether it was nature of nurture with this experiment shows that it's compatible with the idea that it's nature, because nurture, of course, cannot even decide which part of the brain to use, because we don't even have control on the part of our brain. Then there is actually one fact that I was not going to emphasize too much, but I thought that, especially in relation to what Stan said before, could be very useful. That is, one could say that syntax and sound are just the medium to communicate my thought to someone else who is listening. But what happens when I don't speak? That is, what happens when I just think or read in my mind? And as you imagine, the same question could be said to what happens to people who are in a vegetative state or whose consciousness is not active in the same sense that the normal subject is. Well, we actually made an experiment that was to try to understand what happens to language when language never goes out of your mouth. That is, during the so-called endophasic activity or inner speech. Actually, we adopted a completely different technique, that is awake surgery, and the person here belonged to a different group, in particular Lorenzo Magrassi from the University of Pavia, a neurosurgeon and engineer Giuseppe Romataris. And by adopting awake surgery techniques, it has been possible to prove that even when we just think on words, their sound is represented in the brain. In other words, syntax can also be detected during inner speech, not because we have any clue or we don't have a special clue on the syntactic structure, but because at least we do have we can measure the electric activity of the brain and know that at that level, without speaking, sound is represented. Of course, as any discovery that can be used to help people to get their thoughts out of their mind if they are paralyzed, or in a sci-fi future policy, people can get your secrets from your brain. That's up to ethics. I'm not going to discuss that here. But what is important to say is that the syntax is not only something that is useful to communicate, but it's something which is incorporated in the very process of language processing, even without communication. Then we can conclude that the boundaries of Babel, that is the limit in which languages must keep their rules. For example, they cannot be linear, they have to be hierarchical, and the variability of syntactic rules among languages is severely restricted by biologically driven principles which precede any experience. And this is crucial. Before going to that, let me just summarize here. If neuroscience, when meeting linguistics, gives you the idea that the format of language rules is shaped by the architecture of the brain. We have a lot of consequences to compute. For example, there is one consequence which is obvious. If this is true, that is, if languages are the execution of a genetic program, as our liver, our heart, our lungs is, we cannot have more complex grammar than others because there is no people who have a more complex liver or a more complex heart. So what we see as different in complexity must be something we misunderstand. Actually, there is something very delicate I want to say here. Suppose that the grammar is at least divided into 4 segments. One that relates to sounds, phonetics, one that relates to words, morphology, one that relates to syntax, the composition of words, and one that relates to meaning. It's obviously the case that when you touch one component, all the others are touched. In other words, language is more similar to a Rubik's Cube than a real cake. Something that is so complex that when you have consequences in one module, that when you change something in one part, you have a consequence in others. And in fact, there's no one who has any objective measure of complexity of grammar. A priori, if this is a genetic program, we have to imply that all languages are as complex. In fact, there's a kind of a natural proof of the uniformity among languages. And the natural proof comes for free because across languages, including sign languages, children acquire their languages within the same amount of time, practically. There are very many experiments trying to measure that. One very beautiful experiment by Unietska et al. 2016, for example, measured the difference of acquisition in 290 words across 25 languages, and they practically see a similarity across languages. It would be impossible if that thing would be completely and only cultural. There is, of course, one possible criticism that I want to address before any other question. That is, it could be the case, in fact, it's commonly assumed that certain languages have better words to express certain ideas. And this may be helpful when it comes to synthesis. If I can say a long concept with one word and you have to go on with a number of words, you may be faster than I am. But does it really affect our understanding of reality? Does it really affect our understanding of our expression? Since there is no limit to recombination in syntax, every idea can be expressed in any language via syntactic structure, by combining words together, which is the classical term periphrasis. That is, I can say instead of one word, I can use a different number of words. To let me give you one example, I have anyone can get in love with anything. I got in love with the verb to be. So to be and not to be is my best preferred slogan. And the reason why I'm saying that is that I am interested in the verb and not in the concept. But if the understanding of the notion of being depended on the presence of the verb to be in many languages, this notion would not be understandable because this verb is missing. And this is something that I explore here. But in honor of my colleague, I provide another evidence for why language can, in fact, get rid of problems when it comes to different words. In my language and in English, there is one single word to express this, potato. But if I go to French or to my own dialect, Northern Italian dialect, there is no single word. In fact, I have to say pomme de terre, which is a periphrasis that is clear, but it's not the case. The cooks in French, at least not that I know of, are better skilled to treat with this kind of food and cook them instead of other. And this happens all over the concepts. What you can say in one language, you can actually say in the other. There is a kind of myth of ingenious languages, but there is no ingenious languages. What is ingenious is a comment to normal languages. In fact, one of the most famous comments on what is supposed to be the ingenious languages, la langue géniale, la lingua geniale, that is Greek, made in the 13th century by Bacon, stated exactly this. There is only one grammar in every language according to its substance, although there can be accidental variations. You can think that this could be true or of fixed languages across centuries, but languages may change. And so you can say, well, but a certain language can become a better language after 2 or 3 centuries. Actually, this requires a very careful distinction between evolution and change when it comes to linguistics. There is another quotation that I would like to address here by Noam Chomsky, who said, languages are not organisms. They don't have genomes. They don't evolve. Language change, but they don't evolve. What evolves is the language capacity of users of language, that is, of human beings. I think that one of the best way to capture this idea is by taking an example for painting. This is a study by Albrecht Dürer, who was trying to show us that all faces are in fact the same project, and that the difference are just, you know, different distortion of the same geometry. In a sense, I cannot say that that I have a more evolved face than my father, and my son does not have a more evolved face than mine. We have the same kind of face, although we're different. Change and evolution are different. So even with respect to this, we could actually assume that we do speak one language. But there is one fact, which is under our eyes, I would say under our ears, if I had to be consistent with the kind of stimulus I'm talking of, which is the fact that not all languages are mutually understandable. If I said I'm speaking all languages, this is plain not true when it comes to communication. But the fact that languages are not all mutually comprehensible may have had a positive impact on evolution by maintaining human communities at a manageable size. In fact, this happens in animals with diseases. It happens that certain groups cannot be too big, and so the size of the community is taken together by the fact that if you exceed a certain number of individuals in the group, then diseases can spread more easily, and you either divide the group into subgroups or the group is eliminated. In a sense, nowadays, it would be even more dramatically clear that during our evolution, there was a kind of social distance that was due to language difference. And that may have had a very positive impact on evolution. Perhaps Babel was not a curse. Perhaps it was a gift. Perhaps all differences are. You may say that what I'm telling you is about this thing about the way we see the world with words. It could be just, you know, a preoccupation of an old linguist, but I think it is not. I think that there is a danger that we have to avoid by putting together the discovery of linguistics and neuroscience. And let me tell you what the danger is. There are two independent, apparently innocuous ideas that, if combined, can give rise to a devastating theory. First idea, some languages are better than others, the one that I tried to tell you that it is not. Second idea, different languages imply different perceptions of reality and reasoning. These two ideas are independent, but if you combine them together, you have the obvious conclusion that certain languages give a better perception of reality and reasoning. You may think that this is, again, a preoccupation of linguistics, but this is not. This is, in fact, the germ that started one of the most colossal crime of human history, that is the Shoah. Everything started when, in a book in the second half of the 19th century, it was theorized that there was a perfect society with perfect social relation, with perfect conception, that have a perfect language, and perfect or noble in that language was expressed with the term Aryan. And here is excerpts from the book. You see, the term language was immediately linked to the term race. The presence of certain letters in certain languages or families of languages, the inability of some races to distinguish either in hearing or speaking. Another one, a difference almost incomprehensible to certain races. Another one, Aryan race. And then the obvious fact that the idea that a race was there as opposed to another can be settled by language only. This was dismantled by the end of the 19th century. Linguists did not believe this. But the propaganda, the political propaganda, did use this notion, and they came up by the first part of the 20th centuries, with the Reichsbürgergesetz protecting the Aryan race. So you see how politics can, use some ideas with the propaganda, and if there is a virus we have to contrast beside the obvious biological one, is the one that comes from the idea that there are better languages, and the languages are a filter to understanding the world. Trying to reach the conclusion, we are in a fortunate era. You are in an era where we can see inside of heads without opening the skull, and we can see the earth from the moon. And I assume that the real value of neurolinguistics is not that it offers new answers, but that it offers a new perspective to formulate new questions. In fact, I would like to assume that if the people who attend to this series of conferences that Fondazione Prada was organizing is the number of questions that you will come up with. If you have the same questions, we didn't reach our goal. If you have more questions than before listening to us, then we do have it. And the conclusion is that when we talk about language, we do face a destabilizing paradox. We have a finite object shaped by evolution, the brain, that expresses a code, syntax, generating an infinite discrete structure that cannot evolve by definition. Infinity cannot come in pieces. There is no half of infinity and then the whole infinity. Infinity is either there or not there. And once more, language reveals itself as the constant scandal of nature. What is missing from my picture now? My talk and Stan Dehaene talk are in a sense complementary. He left me the anatomy of the structure of human language, and I didn't speak about conscious directly, but there is actually one aspect of what I say that I would like to highlight, and is the limit of our understanding of language. To do so, I decided to use a painting by a strange painter, Johannes Kuhn, who only made 2 copies of the same painting. One is round and the other is square. This one is in Italy at the Uffizi. It's very dark, but the painting is as follows. There is a painter who has a mirror on his left and a canvas on his right. He looks at himself in a mirror and paints the canvas on the right. We don't see the face of the painter. So I would like to see that we see language regularity outside us and we represent them, but the core engine of creativity and consciousness escapes us for now. I'm not sure if it will escape forever, but it does for now, to the extent that the linguist is interested in how the structure is built and tells a lot about how the brain itself is built. What should we do then? What are linguists called to do? Again, with the final, almost final image, I would like to show you one thing that surprised me when I first saw it. Our brain here is obviously seeing a circle going around and around in another circle, but there is no circular movement whatsoever. All the dots are moving on a straight line on the diameter of the circle. It's our brain that computes the symphony of straight movement as a circular movement. Understanding the brain and language means reducing complex phenomena to the interaction of simple facts. Sentences must be reduced to the interaction of facts that may not look like sentences. Similar thing with meaning, similar things with phonology. I don't know if I convinced you. Also, as standout, let me show you, I put a lot of stuff in this book, but I was also, during my youth, exposed to the lesson of another maestro, Umberto Eco, who once said, those things about which you cannot theorize, you must narrate. And so what I did was I invented a story with an impossible language that was forced to be learned by people. And I don't reveal you the final because it's up to you to discover. And thank you very much for having let me your time.
So thank you so much, Andrea. Funnily enough, you convinced me. All right, I'm going to read some questions we had from the audience, okay? And most of them are addressed to one or the other speaker, but please, you can really answer both of you to them. Andrea, you were talking about politics, linguistics. So there's one interesting question, okay? It's very, very general. What were the words used in the history that triggered the worst consequences? If you had to choose, it's a question to you, if you had to choose one word to delete from all the vocabularies, which one would you delete? Stan, it's also a question to you.
Can I do the other thing around? Can I say what words should I include? Actually, words to me, in a sense, are like knives. What do you use a knife for? You can cut bread, or you can cut your brother, depending on what you want to do. Yeah. Any words can be used in any possible way. So there is not a single word that I would say had a potential bad.
Maybe it's more about deleting a meaning and not the word, because a word is just a form of a meaning. It conveys a meaning.
Yeah, I don't think that there is any meaning we should delete. We should be aware of all the meaning. For example, I am against all kind of censorships. Things have to be known even if you want to preserve from going back to a certain situation in the past, you have to go through. You cannot avoid understanding. I think that this was very clear from what Stan said. Humans combine thoughts, knowledge, and awareness. You cannot delete it. In fact, if I should say something, I would like to say that those who think that by deleting a word, you have a better world are wrong.
I was going to say very much the same as Andrea, although we did not think together about that. But I just gave my course at Collège de France on the Worfian hypothesis and the dependency of thought on language. And the conclusion is really there is not much dependency of thought on language. Thought is hidden inside, and it's a very general property of all human brains. So in the first course, and it's all available online on the Collège de France website for those of you who want to see it, I discuss 1984. And the question you're asking is very much one which is out of this novel, 1984, where they are progressively removing words from the dictionary. And they are hoping in this way to create a dictatorship because you would not be able to think the corresponding concepts. It's completely false. It's not because you have a word or don't have a word that you can or cannot think the concept. And in fact, what we are showing in my work is that much of mathematical concepts are completely outside of language. They are really internal and in a certain sense predate the concepts.
All right, thank you. A question to Stan, okay, related to your talk. The fact baboons don't recognize regularity in geometric shapes could be a cultural issue? Maybe humans wouldn't be able to recognize baboons' different voices.
It's interesting. So we try to address this question by looking at people who have had a very different cultural experience, such as the Himba, or who have had no education and no training. We still find very much the same regularity. Of course, it's still a bit open, and this is very recent data, but we think that we are tapping here an extremely basic mechanism, which is common to all humans, regardless of education. Mathematics is a construction, so there is no doubt that some concepts of mathematics are culturally constructed and dependent on education. But at the foundation, what we are finding is we all have the same concepts, space and number in particular. And then out of these atoms, much like Andrea described, we have the atoms at the floor, but then the combinations are, of course, culturally created.
Well, Andrea, do you want to add something on this? I mean, would we be able to understand different voices of baboons? Actually, as a linguist, I mean, your opinion?
There is a question that people keep asking me, that is, could we recognize a language from a creature of the space, of an extraterrestrial language? This is an interesting question, because how do we recognize that something is coming from some entity that has our intelligence? The only thing, beside the fact that we have to receive something that touches our senses, light, sound, flavors, or we have to see certain regularities. And the kind of regularities we can see should be only those compatible with our own way of combining stuff. Stan has done a wonderful work in the electrophysiological sense to see what happens if you have a string of words all together that have no syntax and combining up and up and up with more syntax. Then this gives you like the X-ray of a language. And whether animals or extraterrestrial want to communicate with us, they have to be compatible, sensorial and structurally with us. Otherwise, maybe we already have our extraterrestrial around us, but we simply don't understand them, or our cats and dogs.
Exactly, Andrea. I'm happy with this because I was always sure I understand fully when my cat is hungry, the different voices it makes to me, so I'm happy with this answer. A very pertinent question to this, okay? Still to you, Andrea. Someone is asking us, can we train an animal to be bilingual, taking the same order in different languages?
Well, this has been done with a certain kind of birds. There is a very extremely interesting experiment that was done with the so-called cowbirds in America. These birds have different songs depending on the area where they were born. So they did one wonderful experiment by taking the egg of one cowbird and being it, with the mother of a community different from the one where it was taken. And then the bird was able to speak the language of the new community from mothers who were mute. How can it be the case? And the experiment tells that the birds, when the bird is born, he tried to express all the languages he has inside, and the mother only responds to one language and feeds him. The one that is used to feed him becomes his language. More or less, this is the same we do with sounds. When we are kids, we have all our sounds in our mind, in our head. In fact, if I were raised in Tokyo, I would have a Japanese accent. And then after a certain age, everything is fixed. Our common maestro, Jacques Meller, who passed away this year, but he gave the deepest influence in the field, had this term, you can learn by forgetting. You have an enormous amount of complexity and possibility when you're born, like a staminal mind, and then what is not used and is forgotten falls down, and what remains there is your structure. And I think that this is one of the most beautiful and revolutionary pictures that we all share, Stan I and Chomsky and other communities.
Yes, in fact, the word to learn is to select is actually from Jean-Pierre Changeux, from the Neuronal Man.
Yes.
And yeah, this is something we share. I want to say that we did a lot of experiments on bilingualism. And we're still doing some right now, actually, on readers who can read two languages, like Chinese and French, for instance. And the findings from all of these experiments is, to show the universality of the human brain. It's not because you speak Chinese that you have a different brain. And when we scan bilingual speakers, they're using exactly the same circuits, actually, almost exactly, in order to read Chinese and to read French. Okay, when we zoom in, maybe we will find some small circuit differences, but by and large, it's extraordinarily similar. And so I think our work also points to the unity of the human brain.
Yes, I wanted to add something to you, to this story about if an animal can learn a question. I remember I read a book by Franco Fabro years ago, in which he mentions to sparrows and canary birds, who could, as you mentioned, if you bring them from one bird community to a different one, they would, after a couple of weeks, learn the local dialect. And he mentioned that these are the only two species, birds, that have left-sided language areas. A sort of something comparable. You want to say something to that? Because there's no other species that has a language organ in the brain, actually.
I don't know if you can speak of a language organ in the brain of birds, but there are some interesting genetic similarities. There is a beautiful science paper a few years ago showing genetic mechanisms of circuits in the brain of the bird and the human are slightly similar in humans and birds. But I don't think you can speak of language circuits, no. You have essentially premotor mechanisms of song generation that have some similarity with the mechanisms of control of the voice in humans. It's interesting. I mean, the really important thing is to distinguish species that are vocal learners. There are some species that are able to learn their song, just like Andrea was describing, you know, with dialects. It's not at all innate. There is a really strong learning component. And in all of these vocal learners, in spite, of course, of the considerable differences between the human brain and these birds' brain, you find some circuit similarities. But I wouldn't want to call it a language organ. I think it's just a much simpler sequence production organ.
Actually, as a linguist, I would converge with what Stan was saying by saying that I wouldn't even call a language. People keep saying that birds especially can recognize complex sequences, which is true, but most of them are symmetries, are sequences that are repeated. None of them is able to manage with complexity that goes beyond what Chomsky discovered in that book that I showed, the syntactic structure, which is called in mathematical term a Markovian chain. This is crucial. And actually, it's also interesting that the new computing capacity of machines may suggest that if not animals, maybe machines can learn a language. But it's simulation. It's like when I make a calculation with my cellular phone. I made a calculation, but it's probably not even isomorphous to what happens in my brain.
Then maybe we disagree a little bit. I think there's been progress in machine learning that shows that there seems to be in some of these machines a capacity for recursion. It begins to look like so we are analyzing this at the moment, and okay, there are some differences, but it's getting closer and closer to the human syntactic ability. And
no, but I agree that you can simulate that. What I don't agree is that you can read that the understanding of the hardware of a machine may be isomorphous to the hardware of the neurons. It may be, but it does not prove that it is. But the fact that it can actually, that machine can learn faster and easily, that's clearly the case.
Then I think we agree. I think there is a lot of very interesting work to do at the moment to study what the current AI machines are able to do. And at the same time, I defend very much this idea that they are very far from the capacity of the human brain.
Yes.
This is a central theme of my book, How We Learn. The learning of language in a human baby is much faster and much richer, much deeper than anything that happens in the current machines, even in the best machines are Google.
I agree. In fact, take, for example, what used to be said in the 70s and the 80s. Brains are hardware, languages are software. You can run any software on the brain, which is not true.
No, it's completely untrue.
If anything, the languages are the software that the hardware expresses. So it's the other way around. People keep insisting on that, but there is a commercial reason for this. If you buy a new computer, you know, there are times when you buy a neural machine, a neural chip. There is nothing neural in that, but people are attracted to buying stuff that is called neural. If you buy a neural car, maybe you would have more success than if you buy a normal engine.
Excellent. Question to Stan. Your talk seemed to be about mapping how and what we perceive. Do you see the language of thought as including ideas such as free will and choice?
Well, the discussion of free will is a very difficult one, actually, because I think we mix up two different concepts. And I also think it has nothing to do with language. It is something that we can discuss also in animals, whether they have free will or not. But okay, there are two notions of free will. There is one notion according to which we are we have a capacity to detach our decisions from the physics. We have a capacity to be random and to sort of go beyond the deterministics of physics. And I think that view is completely wrong. We are, our entire thought patterns are ultimately determined by the physical organization of our brains. And in this sense, we have no real free will. But in another sense, we do, because we have the architectures for decision. So if you consider tasks that have to do with free will, there are tasks in which you have enough time to decide, and you're able to bring your values and your knowledge and your memories in order to take a decision. And this is the conditions where we say we exercise our free will. In this sense, I think we do have free will. We have a prefrontal cortex that allows us to detach ourselves from the immediate experience, to think quietly as long as we need. And that's this workspace system, that stabilizes ideas so that we can think about them. And this is an architecture for free will. In this sense, a machine can have free will. If it has enough resources to deliberate and think, it may have a form of free will. It's autonomous in its decisions. But is it undetermined by physics? Not at all. And in fact, if you think of, okay, I'm exercising my free will because I go to vote, and this is, of course, something that is in our minds these days, I go to vote, I exercise my free will because I think about it and I do the decision that I want without being forced by other people. But it's deterministic. If people try to guess my vote, I'm not going to vote for Mr. Trump. This is highly predictable. So my values guide my judgment in a certain direction, which is predictable. If we separate these two meanings, I think that the workspace architecture that I described for consciousness is actually an architecture for free will. It allows us, and I think it's the general evolution of consciousness, it allows us to detach from the immediate contingencies of sensory motor reactions, which are often automatic and unconscious, and to deliberate.
Can I add one thing?
You want to add something, Andrea?
Yes. There is a name for free will in language, which is language creativity. Namely, beside few situations, you cannot predict the word that I am saying in 3 seconds. Would I say cake or car or nose? This is a form of free will. It's like generating something that nothing in the environment can force or predict. And this is the reason why I kept distance from that part of language. And I only give you the range of possibilities. But which one you use, whether you want to say a man is painting the wall or the wall is painted by a man, that cannot be predicted. Grammar is the space, is the equivalent of the space that Stan was referring to. You choose, grammar are construed in order to allow free will. There's no things that, force the other necessarily.
But you see, Andrea, I really want to draw a distinction between randomness and free will, which I think many people don't distinguish these concepts enough.
I agree.
When you are random, you're not exercising free will. In fact, if you have Tourette syndrome and you have random gestures or random words, this is not free will.
But
and if we do this distinction correctly, then all of these stupid discussions about whether quantum processing is required for free will, whether we need a quantum consciousness and so on, they all disappear. And I think free will is compatible with a deterministic brain and a physical brain.
Yeah, no, that I agree. And in fact, if I may something which is completely counterproductive right now, I would say that the way that Penrose has to refer to quantum mechanics in order to have free will is baroque. I mean, it's unnecessary.
Yeah, I agree totally. I have so much admiration for Penrose. I was so happy that he's getting the Nobel Prize. Yes. But the consciousness book is
but it's another thing. But in fact,
outside of
and in fact, I think that we don't. The partition is trifold because along with your kind of free will, that is what I'm going to vote, who I'm going to kill, what I'm going to do, who I'm going to, whatever. There is also the free will at the level of composition. That is, what kind of sentence am I going to produce? And we don't know anything about that. But what is worse, we don't even know how to know something about this. There's no experimental clue to get what Descartes, in fact, called creativity in this sense. And that may be one of the mysteries that Chomsky talks about, that may lie forever outside our capacity. But this is why we still do research, by decomposing complexities.
I've selected here a very interesting question. It was addressed to Andrea, but also I want also Stan to answer to it. I like it pretty much. Are the people more gifted for languages? how does their brain work better for learning different languages? And I mean, this is something also important. You see at the kindergarten, like little girls aged 4 or 5 years old, they already talk so much, sentences elaborated, and then you see maybe the same age boy who is still at the word level but not at the sentence level. So where does this difference come from? And as the question goes on, is asking, are some people more gifted learning multiple languages? And we all know there are some people who just really absorb languages, multiple languages, and they become hyperglots, and some not. Andrea, I want you to start.
Me?
Yes.
It's like singing. Of course, there are individual differences, but this would be surprising, especially if language was completely disconnected from biology. If it is connected with biology, then you have difference all over the typical features that give, the typical traits of a human being. They're differing in singing. Someone can sing a melody in tune, some other cannot. This doesn't touch the architecture of music. It depends on several factors that may not have to do anything with culture. If Amadeus Mozart did not have the special ear, his father could have taken him to a palace and tried to sing and play, but they would not have, he would not have become a musician. In fact, I do think that this is a very indirect proof that when it comes to language, nature rather than nurture matters.
Well, as you all know, I mean, there are some studies done in the past about, like in the case of multilinguals, that if you have a better working memory, a verbal short-term memory, you can keep online more phonemes and combine them. But I mean, this is old stuff. But as you say, biology makes a difference.
Yes, but 100 years ago, this discussion was impossible. Because, remember that Lenneberg, in his wonderful book, Biological Foundation of Language, and he was working in Boston in the 60s, he discovered that people with aphasia could recover better if the stroke or, the cause of the aphasia was before puberty than after puberty. And that was the first break in the community to think that biology may matter with language. And in the introduction of Lenneberg to the book, he really says that philosophers, in fact, he criticizes Wittgenstein, thinking of language as a social rule made it impossible to study language as a biological thing. And that one of the reasons why I have 50 years of delay compared to there are two reasons. One is this, and the other is the fact that we cannot have animal models for syntax. And that's obviously the other reason.
I think if I try to answer this question, it's a difficult one. I don't think we understand much about the individual differences at the moment. And it's made extremely complicated in the case of humans because it's a combination of biology and education. So undoubtedly, there are biological differences. We can go to one extreme, which is language impairments. There are some developmental language impairments, and there are some children who are perfectly intelligent, but they have anomalies, for instance, in the connections in what we call the arcuate fasciculus, which is a very important circuit for language. And when this circuit does not develop normally, they might be totally aphasic and unable to speak and to learn languages. But I also want to stress the importance of education and early education. There is tons of evidence that different children are not getting the same sort of inputs. And there is very beautiful evidence now showing that the quality of the inputs that children are getting determines their ability to learn languages. There are huge differences according to a social milieu in which you are born. And the recent research has shown that what's really important is that children get child-directed speech. It's not enough to absorb speech in your environment. In fact, in this respect, maybe some of Chomsky's writings were a little bit misleading. It's really the child-directing speech which is important. It's the dialogue, it's the interaction where an adult or another child of an older age makes the effort to respond and to have this back and forth between two brains.
Yeah.
So there is clearly some education-related factor here, and this may have a cascade of effects later on the ability to learn other languages, I suspect.
I have a question from a viewer to both of you. Jung, the psychoanalyst Jung, described in his works that geometrical figures were the basis of the collective unconscious. Can somehow this be linked to the study about the human preference of geometrical regularity?
This is so interesting. I was discussing recently that I should read more Jung. Typically, we don't read Jung much in cognitive science, you know, but it's true. There is this general idea of archetypes, including geometrical figures, but not just that, also stories and so on, that tend to recur in many different cultures. And one possibility is that indeed they belong to the sort of basic geometric repertoire of what our brains can generate, a sort of basic tree structures that we can all generate. So all cultures eventually think of counting and counting on their fingers. All cultures eventually think of geometrical patterns, and they paint their bodies and they do parallel lines. For instance, parallel lines are all over the place in all cultures. So I think we could explain some of the Jungian archetypes, and I confess I have to read more about this, but I think we could explain many of them not by some kind of sharing of minds across the world, but by the much more basic biological architectures of our brain. This is, to a large extent, this is my current project.
There is, in fact, actually, I want to say two things. One is a funny thing that the protagonist of my novel has 11 fingers because I wanted him to.
How does he count?
Exactly, because I wanted people to reflect on the fact that we have that body, and it's, you know, because of the way we're built, that our culture is shaped. But the other thing is that I was very pleased to see the funny drawing you show in your talk with the people from the Stone Age that were looking at this geometrical scene of chasing. Actually, there are two aspects of beauty of symmetry. One is the naive beauty that you have in the symmetry of, you know, like a Greek vase. Really a pure symmetry that you recognize in reality. And the other is the hidden symmetry. And to me, one of the cathedral of humans, the thing that I would send in the outer space to show that we are intelligent is any painting by Cézanne that was able to uncover the geometry of reality and make it clear that everything is nothing but the composition of pure geometrical forms. And this is something that always moves me in a sense, because art precedes sometimes our understanding of reality in that sense.
Well, then we have an interesting question to both of you, which states, to what era can a primordial language be traced back? Is it possible to know elements of the most ancient syntax? I'm just presuming, like, if you go back in the days to Sumerian or ancient Egyptian, you have any notes on syntax?
Me or Stan?
I think you should respond, Andrea.
Well, I had a note in Impossible Languages and the Boundaries of Babel. I do it when I meet students of the first class. I ask them, what would convince you that a certain group of people had a language similar to ours if you don't have anything written? And that is interesting. You have two immediate answers. First, if you see architectures. Second, if you see a social complexity. And then I tell them, when with the first case, it's enough to, when you go and see bees, bees have constructions that are perfections in terms of geometry, but they don't have a language. And when it comes to hierarchical societies, ants have a queen, so it cannot be that. Then what would tell us that humans have a language, to me, could only be by considering a sufficient span of time and see if there is progress. Animals do not have progress. A spider builds his nets the same way that his father spider and grandpa spider made. We do not start civilization when we were born and discovery fire at 4 and the wheel at fire and go on. We capitalize on what was done before. And that can only be conveyed if we have an enoughly rich language. And to me, progress is the only landmark that may make you infer that that community had something similar to our language.
So I think this is very interesting, Andrea. I think you're referring to communicative language.
Yes.
The capacity to communicate
Yes.
would allow humans to suddenly explode as a society and progress together, because
Yes.
what one individual learns,
Yes.
another person can also learn quicker. I think, by the way, this is very definitional of humans and completely missing from machines. When we discuss AI, we forget that these machines learn by themselves, but they never learn from others. They are unable to share what they have learned. So they are really missing something dramatic. But I like your definition. And if we define it this way, I think the origins of language are probably not older than 100,000 years or something like that, when there was really an explosion, cultural explosion, and in many places in the globe. So the upper Paleolithic. However, if we think of language as this internal medium for representation, like the beginning of mathematics, then I wonder whether this could be much older. I'm very struck by these bifaces, artifacts that have pure symmetry that really require conceptualization before you dig them out of the stone. And this perhaps is as old as 2 million years now. But it could be an internal medium of representation, and only as a second step evolved the capacity to share it with others through the communication of language.
Yes, I completely agree with that.
Stan, there's a question to you, because it's more like to be a bit precise. What is meant by human singularity, and why should it be considered a value?
By singularity, I mean something particular to humans. It's a debated term. Some people think there is no uniqueness, and that because of Darwinian evolution, we have to be continuous with other species. But I think there are cases in evolution where the change is non-linear, and it leads to something which is essentially unique, very new. And I think this is the case with humans, as we can see from the fact that, contrary to every other species, we have no real niche. We are able to adapt to any niche. In my book, I try to argue that the niche of humans is learning. We are homo docens. We are able to learn. That's our niche, the capacity to learn. It's amazing that we can learn about stars from billion light years, you know? This is completely crazy. We never evolved for that. So our evolution really created something new. And that's what I mean by singularity. The discontinuity out of a continuum of evolution, of course.
I just have a question coming in, and which I like pretty much. It's very important. It's addressed to Andrea. In Italian and other Latin languages, usually nouns that indicate prestigious occupations are usually masculine, like avvocato for lawyer, presidente for president, and so on. Would it be useful generating feminine nouns to reduce gender differences in employment? Would it change attitude and behavior toward women?
My straightforward answer, why not? But the effect is as women has to be paid as much as men. There is no, the linguistic maquillage sometimes is only used to keep away the responsibility of societies. I hate it when people force other people to say la capitana, but then he's not paid as much as the others. And if there would be a mapping between gender and equality, then languages with no gender would be the languages with more equality. Like, for example, Turkish has no gender. The position of the condition of women in Turkey is very, very low compared to other societies. So I don't think that there is a mapping. I discussed this in another book that I recently wrote, I didn't mention here, which is called only in Italian, La razza e la lingua, where I make it clear that anything you can do to promote equality has to be done. But don't think that it comes from grammar. Equality is a political decision. Even wearing pants for women, I shouldn't say maybe that probably in Prada Foundation, but the way we dress is a political decision, isn't it? When I was a young man, women used to be dressed with skirts, and then they decided to wear pants because that was a political decision. It was not an anatomical reason. And so grammar can be forced wherever we like, but we have to make it clear that it's not because of grammar that we have a better society.
Stan, do you want to add something on this point?
No, I think that I couldn't say it better.
Great. I'll make you another question to Stan. What is the relationship between language and mathematic acquisition in relation to brain plasticity?
Actually, we are finding that there is very little relation between math and language. I was surprised by that. But if we scan people and we compare which areas of the brain are activated when they do math and which areas are activated when they do spoken language or written language, they are completely different. There are cases of what we call double dissociation. Some people are completely aphasic after a brain lesion, for instance, and yet they continue to be able to do algebra. And vice versa, you have people who have lots of trouble with mathematics, but they can still speak and understand language written or spoken very well. The relation is one of dissociation, at least in adults. In the course of education, of course, we need language in order to communicate ideas. So language is like a pointer, or I compare it to a catalyst. A catalyst brings together the objects of thought, they click together, and then the catalyst can go away, and the objects of thought have been created, and they are independent of language. I think this is what's happening in education.
All right. Andrea, I have a very philosophical question to you from one viewer, so, okay, be prepared. What are today, in contemporary studies of language, the dialectical relationships between philosophical intuition and empirical discovery?
There is no empirical discovery per se. You always have to have a philosophical background to understand reality. Philosophy comes first, always. Apples have been falling on Earth and the moon rotating around the Earth for centuries. It was only when one person decided that he could dare thinking whether the two movements were connected that Isaac Newton, expressed the theory of gravity. It's always philosophy first. The problem is that they tend to make us think that it's empirical data first. Of course, philosophy has to face empirical data. Come on, we are not mysticists. What do we say? We don't have a mystical mind. I mean, we have to make predictions. Science needs to make prediction, but the way you collect the data has to have a philosophical prejudice. Even when it comes to language that is so clear, there is no way to distinguish between sentences and string of words if you do not use the notion of truth. And the notion of truth is the most philosophical notion whatsoever. And that truth is not in the facts. So you see, the dialectical things between philosophy and empirical research is a wrong way to look at the way we think. We start with an idea and we see if it works, and allows us to make new prediction. And then maybe it can let us change our philosophical view. But there's no distinction. If there is a distinction, then we're going the wrong way.
Andrea, you just mentioned something really very deep, the truth, okay? I reckon you're both member of the Pontifical Academy. Stan, the Pontifical Academy of Science, and you, Andrea, the Pontifical Academy of Arts and Letters. So, what's your point about truth, religion, and science, to both of you?
You were named by the previous Pope, so go first.
Yes, I've been a member of this academy for almost 20 years, 20 years actually now. Well, I want to say our role is purely scientific. I don't consider religious issues, but I think it's very important to have a scientific look on the ethical issues that the church may be confronted with. There's been a continuous evolution of ideas. It's wrong to think of religious ideas as static. Science has its role to play in bringing some rationality to these debates. For instance, there was a time where donating organs was considered horrible because you had to take the organs from a living body. So how could you do that? Well, then the ideas evolved, and now the church completely accepts the notion of brain death, which is not trivial. It's a scientific concept that you are dead when your brain is dead. And you can then donate your organs, and now it's considered one of the most beautiful gestures that you can have on the part of a family, to donate the organs of a recently deceased member. So I see it as a metaphor. Our goal as scientists is to slowly help change the ideas to a more rational state of affairs, if we can.
Andrea?
As for me, although, you know, just discussing of the notion of truth will take us another 7 days here, and I don't think we're allowed to. I would just say one thing, that one of my goals in my own personal life and activities to show that scientific methods is not completely disconnected from the possibility to be confident in someone else's work. You do not restart science when you open your lab. You have to rely on someone else. And then connection of reliance is, in a sense, similar to what keeps together people with faith. So the other side of the coin is to show that there is nothing irrational in faith.
Okay. Thank you to both. We're coming to an end. It's 9 o'clock. I really want, on behalf of the Fondazione Prada, thank to you both, okay, for your wonderful talks. And we also thank the audience for following us. And please remember, tomorrow at 7 p.m. Central European Time will be our 4th session. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Stan. And to the audience, please stay safe. We are living in a pandemic. And goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Stan.